Hello, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to the second video in the world of ecology. We're going to be going over some key vocabulary words, talking about ecosystems and food chains and food webs and predator-prey relationships. So that is what you are learning today, is how ecosystems function using words such as habitat and niche. By the end of this, I am hoping that you will have figured out some key vocabulary words that you can define a food chain versus a food web. You can tell me the difference essentially between the two, as well as telling me how animals compete, the relationships between predator prey, and interactions such as interspecific and intraspecific. We're going to start today in the world of our vocabulary. So you can see quite a few words there. These words, guys, are going to show up time and time and time again as we move forward in Bio 20 and then into Bio 30 at the end of the year. If you are planning on taking any sort of ecology courses in university, they will also be needed. Now, you've probably seen these words before, as you have probably defined them in things such as Science 9. So the environment is anything and everything that affects the organism throughout its life. So anything that has an effect on the organism or the organism affects itself is called the environment. Abiotic and biotic are kind of intertwined. Essentially, abiotic refers to anything that is not living within an environment. So rocks, dirt, things like that. Anything living, okay, is going to be called biotic. Bio or biology, bios is the root word, means living, means life. When you put a in front of something, it means the absence of. So abiotic would be absence of life or non-living. Species. This is where now we're going to get really specific in talking about levels of an ecosystem. So starting with the word species, species is a group of organisms capable of interbreeding and producing fertile offspring. Now, ladies and gentlemen, I need you to understand a really key part about this: fertile offspring. Just because something can mate and just because something can have children, if those babies cannot have babies, they're not considered to be part of the same species. Something like a mule. If you've ever seen a mule, it's a cross between a horse and a donkey. A horse and a donkey can mate and have a mule, and that mule can grow and become a grown-up mule. But that mule is sterile. It can never have babies. So because it cannot have babies, a donkey and a horse are not of the same species. You can see examples of this through the liger or the tigon if you want. I'll link some videos in here so you can kind of see that. But essentially, you need to understand a species is not about just being able to breed, but it's also about producing the fertile offspring. Once you get a group of species together, so a group of individuals of the same species in the same place and time, we call that a population. So when you think about animals, think about the populations that live around Medicine Hat. They have to be the same species in the same place and the same time. A community takes all of these populations and looks at them as a whole. So if we look at the community of, let's say, down at Strathcona, you have gophers that live down there, owls, you have snakes, okay? Those are populations that live in a small area. That is called a community. What community do they have? When we look at the community and then include the abiotic factors, so the non-living parts of it, now we have a functioning ecosystem. So the animals part of it live in within a community, but when we add in the rocks, the soil, the water, okay, those are non-living factors that have an effect on those animals. That's now called an ecosystem. All ecosystems have to thrive within something called limiting factors. Essentially, they're both living and non-living things that keep the ecosystems from going crazy and going out of control. If we did not have factors that stopped rabbits from breeding, all of Medicine Hat would be covered in rabbits because rabbits breed quickly and produce a lot of offspring. But there are both biotic, such as predators that eat the rabbits, and abiotic, things like sources of food and water, that will stop the rabbits from being able to populating an area rapidly because either they're hungry or thirsty or they're being eaten. All right. So limiting factors kind of keep ecosystems from getting out of control. You need to understand all those definitions, but also understand how each definition builds into the next. That leads us into our topic about habitats and niches. So now I'm going to use words within here that you've probably heard before, but I'm going to say things like species and populations and communities. So keeping those in mind as we move forward. So the habitat of the population, so population, remember, is a group of individuals, same place, same time. The habitat is the physical area that species lives in. For example, owls live in trees. Fish live in water. Those are their habitats. All right. It is dependent upon environmental conditions as well as the conditions that are best suited for their survival. So where they live is going to help them thrive. So if I lived in an area where I did not have the tools to stay alive in my environmental conditions, it's probably not my habitat. My habitat is the area in which I have the best environmental conditions that allow for me to survive. This leads into the topic about your niche. Now, niches are essentially the population's complete role in the ecosystem. So it's not just about what they eat and where they live. It's looking at that population as a whole. How does it have an effect on the ecosystem? It takes into account the organism's job within the ecosystem, anything that is biotic that it needs for survival, such as food. And there's a short video that I'm going to link for you so you can see what niches, a bigger idea of what a niche is. All right. So when we speak about an animal's niche or role in the population or in the ecosystem, we're talking about where does it live? What does it eat? How does it survive? Now that we've kind of had this idea of the difference between a habitat and a niche, habitat is where they live, the niche is the role they play inside that. We're going to look at how animals interact inside an ecosystem. So there's a couple different vocab words that we need to be aware of. You've seen these before. We're just going to add a few more to our understanding. Producers are something you learn about in grade 9. They are what makes their own food. In Bio 20, we refer to them as autotrophs. They are organisms that use the energy of the sun, so plants, to go through photosynthesis. You understand the process of photosynthesis, you understand how plants make energy. If we're talking about organisms that are consuming other organisms in order to get energy, we call them consumers. Again, a word you've probably heard in Science 9. In Bio 20, we refer to them as heterotrophs. Autotrophs, auto meaning they make their own food, hetero meaning they have to eat others to get their food. If we take a closer look at consumers as a whole, consumers are classified into groups based on what they eat. So we have, again, a word you've probably heard before, herbivores, herb, plant. They eat plants. They're termed our primary consumer. So we're going to talk about the words primary consumer, secondary consumer. Again, you may have heard these terms used in Science 9 or even Science 7. So herbivores eat plants, and they are termed our primary consumers because they are the first eaters of the producers. So they're the first group that eats the producers. We also then have carnivores. They're animals that eat other animals. They mostly eat herbivores, and if they do, they're called secondary consumers. If they eat the secondary consumers, we call them tertiary consumers. So essentially, we're building a food chain using terminology. So herbivores would be our producers. Then we would have our primary consumer, secondary consumer, and tertiary consumer, each meaning that it eats the one prior to it. You also have omnivores, like humans. We eat both plants and animals. And the last group that's found within the consumer world are decomposers. Now, the interesting thing about decomposers is that they don't technically fall in line with a food chain. They kind of overarching everything. They encompass everything. Because at every opportunity, decomposers break down matter. So they eat and absorb leftover waste matter, and they return organic and inorganic material back into the soil, air, and water. They are the recyclers of our biosphere. So essentially, they don't fall in a perfect line. They're not part of it. Doesn't go producers, primary, secondary, tertiary, decomposers. And that's because a primary consumer can pass away and a decomposer can come in and help decompose that waste. So decomposers, like I said, are an overarching idea of the entire system. So let's diagram the relationship between all of these, between producers and consumers. What does that look like? Well, you have a producer, and that producer is eaten by a primary consumer. You will notice the direction of my arrows is important, guys. We're showing the way energy moves in a system, not what eats what. Okay, so producers pass their energy to their primary consumer, which is a herbivore. The primary consumer passes its energy to its secondary consumer, and it can be a carnivore or an omnivore. A secondary consumer can pass its energy to its tertiary consumer, which again can be a carnivore or an omnivore. And then we have the decomposer. Again, decomposer can happen at any stage, so it is off to the side. It doesn't fall in line with our food chain. Please make sure you diagram this as a way to help you remember the way that energy is passed up a system, and that's going to become a key concept here in a couple days. I keep saying the word ecosystem. This is in an ecosystem. This is this. We've defined ecosystems as everything that is made up that is living and non-living all together in an area. Okay. This living and non-living interaction is all about self-regulation and about transferring and cycling energy. So that's kind of what we're going to talk about as we move into the next step, is the way that energy is transferred through what we would call feeding relationships. So here we have what we call feeding levels, ladies and gentlemen. We refer to this as trophic levels. That is another new vocab word. Okay, so please make sure you underline it. Trophic levels describe the feeding relationships in ecosystems. Trophic means food, so trophic level means the feeding level. Decomposers can feed at any level, so we kind of don't give them a feeding level, we just call them the decomposers. So on the side, you can kind of see a food chain. You have the sun, then you have your primary producer, primary, secondary, tertiary, quaternary consumer, and then bacteria and decomposers are at the end. Again, remembering it's an overarching idea. I can label these as different levels of feeding. So what that would look like, oops, I went too far. Hold on, my computer is not, there we go. All right, so I can label these, I apologize guys, I can label these as different feeding levels. I can go through and say green plants are feeding level 1, herbivores are feeding level 2, and so forth and so forth. I'm going to show you a diagram. This is the one I would like you to draw when it says draw a diagram of how energy transfers through the trophic system. You obviously do not need to draw the pictures, you can just write the words. So here I have a food chain. A food chain models the linear pathway, so the straight line through which food is transferred from producers to primary consumers and so forth. It's not about the food, it's about the energy. So energy is always being transferred. We know that the laws of physics say that energy cannot be created nor destroyed. So when I make energy or you make energy or a plant makes energy, it has to be passed on to the next level. So here I have my primary producers. My primary producers are creating their own energy through the sun. They are known as autotrophs, and they make their own food. Now, in the world of terrestrial, that can be any type of plant. In marine food chains, that's something called phytoplankton. Phytoplankton are super, 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 super tiny little organisms that actually use the energy of the sun to create energy. They are all known as our first trophic level because they are the first feeding level. They take the energy and use it and convert it. We then move up into the herbivore, or what we would call the zooplankton on the marine side. Again, primary consumers, but we refer to them as our trophic level number 2, so second trophic level. This carries through. Our secondary consumers are our third trophic level. Tertiary consumers are our fourth, and quaternary is our fifth. You'll notice that it offsets as we move up. The first trophic level is part of the producers. The second trophic level matches with primary. So their numbers don't exactly work like as primary, primary, secondary, secondary. But it's easy to remember because if you know you have a secondary consumer, you for sure have a third trophic level feeder. So again, please put the definition of a food chain in your notes. And then it does ask you to diagram the terrestrial and marine food chain. But if you did it in the notes above, that is fine. I'm just going to run through them anyways. So here I have grass as a producer. It's trophic level 1. A grasshopper, which is a primary consumer, is trophic level 2. A mouse is my secondary consumer, but it makes it my trophic level 3. My rattlesnake is a tertiary consumer with trophic level 4. And my hawk is my quaternary at trophic level 5. So this is an example of a terrestrial food chain, showing you the movement of energy up all the way to the hawk, the final apex predator in this situation, the one that eats a lot of everything. And you can see how they're labeled appropriately as we move up the food chain. The marine food chain starts with phytoplankton. It moves forward into zooplankton, then to the clownfish, think Finding Nemo, to a barracuda, who obviously ruined Nemo's dad's life, and to the killer whale. Again, you will notice I've labeled them appropriately. Phytoplankton is our producer with trophic level 1. We have a primary consumer at trophic level 2, and it moves forward all the way up. Again, pause, put in your notes, just so that you have accurate information as we move forward. That takes us into the world of a food web. You've seen food webs before, so I'm going to kind of breeze through this a little bit, but essentially it's the model of energy transferring around an ecosystem amongst many food chains. So this is just demonstrating a food web of a biome in the desert. It differs from a food chain because a food web is made up of lots of food chains. So it's kind of interconnected, but they are different. Food chains are found within the food web. So if I look at this, I can follow the arrows appropriately up to the different things. So I can go grass to rabbit, rabbit to hawk, following the arrows from grass to rabbit, rabbit to hawk. I can go star cactus to the kangaroo, rat to the tarantula to the rattlesnake. These are all distinct food chains found within one food web. That now leads us into our final kind of discussion for the day. There is a little bit of an example that you can complete in your notes about food chains and food webs, which will be key because we're going to have a little bit of assignment that attaches to this. But the last thing I want to talk to you about when it comes to food chains, food webs, ecosystems, communities, populations is that limiting factor definition right from the beginning. Limiting factors make sure that an ecosystem's populations do not get out of control. And one of the ways we control that is through predation, or a predator-prey relationship. The predator-prey relationship shows that as the prey's population grows, so that's what population density means, as the prey's population grows, you will notice the predator's population will follow that. Why? Because there's more food for them to eat, so they can reproduce more and have more babies. But the prey will get to a point where the system as a whole cannot support how many there are, and the predators are eating enough that it keeps them from getting out of control. So you will see that that is what's happening at the top of this peak. The prey were producing, and now they've reached a point where there's just the right amount of food for them, and there's just enough babies, but it also means that the predators' numbers are growing. The predators' numbers are going to keep growing, but what it does is it starts reducing the number of prey. And that's because they're eating it. So it's an ebb and flow kind of thing. As prey population goes up, predator population follows. As prey population decreases, predator population follows. And it keeps this natural flow of up and down through a predator-prey relationship. So these are kind of another example of a predator-prey relationship, looking at the hare and the lynx. Okay, you can see that it's not the perfect diagram from the one before, but you can see that rise and drop, rise and drop, rise and drop. You'll notice though that unfortunately this was a very good example, but then here we're seeing a low population of lynx, but a very big population of rabbits. And you have to remember that predator-prey relationships are natural. They are a natural biotic factor. But something like this probably has some sort of factors involved that are not maybe as natural, such as hunting from humans for lynx pelts. Okay, because if you look at the years when a lot of that was happening, right? The selling of animal furs to wear, they were a pretty big deal. So you are seeing the drop in the lynx population, but that means that the rabbit population can get higher. Eventually, the lynx population may come back if their poaching of them, okay, stops and they are able to recoup their numbers. There are a bunch of questions that I was going to ask you guys about this, but we're going to skip this for today. This will be something you will see later on. The very, very last thing, ladies and gentlemen, I want to discuss with you is interspecific and intraspecific competition. So I've talked about a very special type of biotic factor, which is predation, predator preys. But now we have to look at the community and the populations and essentially the ecosystem as a whole. Okay. Every ecosystem has interactions between a variety of animals. If an organism is competing for resources with members of its same species. Same species. Okay. Same SA. Okay. You get what I'm saying? Intra-specific. So intra-specific competition means we are fighting amongst each other as a species. Interspecific is different, E for different, interspecific. Okay. So now when you're looking at different species competing for resources, we call this interspecific. So the picture of the kangaroos fighting would be an intra, same species. The zebra and the wildebeest competing for water would be interspecific. A way to remember this, maybe, is using the words international and intramurals. International means the whole world. Okay. Different groups of people. Okay. Yes, as a population, humans are the same. But if you think about, if you were to look at us as distinct populations, we're very different. So international means species compete for limited resources that are different from each other. And intramurals, okay, means that you're fighting to win the trophy. In dodgeball, you're playing against the same people. So that's kind of how I remember it. So, ladies and gentlemen, hopefully you were able to follow along, get this stuff in your notes, and I will talk to you soon.